Good afternoon. The Society for Vascular Surgery is sponsoring an audiovisual archives to feature the outstanding leaders and contributors to vascular surgery. A committee was formed to undertake interviews of our most distinguished and famous vascular surgeons. My name is Peter Lawrence, and today I will be conducting an interview with one of our most distinguished vascular surgeons, John Connolly. Dr. Connolly, it's an honor to interview you today. How did you get interested in vascular surgery? Since from what I've read, your training was primarily in cardiac and thoracic surgery.
Well, actually, I've always thought that the two of them sort of came together. But when I was in medical school, I did a lot of attending in the operating room at the Mass General. And there was Bob Linton, who I consider the father of vascular surgery in the United States. And so I got very interested in it from him. Also, Darling, his assistant, was the father of a distinguished Albany surgeon that we all know. But then when I was at Stanford later on as a resident, Dr. Emil Holman was the professor, and he was the last trainee of Halstead's. So he ran the residency program at Stanford at that time, very much like Halstead ran the program when he was the chief. We only found out, he took 6 interns, and only one was going to be the chief resident eventually. And each one only found out in May of each year whether they were going to start the second year or the third year. And if they didn't start, then they peeled off in the ENT or something else. And when I was about to go into the third year of the residency, Dr. Holman called me in and said, I've arranged for your next year to be at the leading cancer hospital in the world. He said, there's no one here at Stanford that knows anything about cancer, surgery. As a matter of fact, there's nobody in the greater San Francisco area that knows anything about it. So you're going to go to Memorial Hospital in New York City. It's all arranged. I had no interview, nothing. He just did that by phone, apparently. And I said, well, Dr. Holman, that's a wonderful idea that you have. However, I don't want to be a cancer surgeon. I want to be a vascular surgeon. And he shook his head like that was just terrible. And I didn't know what was going to happen to me for that next year. Well, 2 weeks later, he called me in the office and he said, okay, Connolly, he said, I heard you. And I've made a different arrangement. You're going to go to London to St. Bartholomew's Hospital for a year. This is the leading, oldest English-speaking hospital in the world. James Patterson Ross, Sir James Patterson Ross is the chief, distinguished vascular surgeon, surgeon to the king, and I think you will enjoy it. So that added up to my interest because when I got there, it was the professorial unit. There were a number of staff who were very interested in vascular surgery. For instance, John Kinmuth, who did the first work on lymphatics, wrote the book on lymphatics. He did the first method of visualizing the lymphatics. Jerry Taylor, who was a contemporary of mine, became the leading vascular surgeon in London. There was another young surgeon there who spoke many languages, and we went over to the continent together, and he introduced me to DeBost, Dos Santos, and Lariche, all who were leading vascular surgeons of the world. And as I look at back on it, I think France was the leading country. So that all added up to an interest in vascular surgery. And I didn't consider the aorta anything different than that connected all parts of the vascular system.
At the time that you were meeting these exceptional people who are now considered some of the giants and founders of vascular surgery, did you know how exceptional they were when you were working with them?
Not really. I guess maybe Lariche, I had heard in our country that he was the father of vascular surgery, but I didn't know that one was going to lead us into vascular surgery, or etc.
During your first faculty position at Stanford, you were selected as a Markle Scholar. First of all, maybe explain what a Markle Scholar is, but more importantly, how that impacted your career, that selection to such a distinguished award.
Well, when I was finishing up at Columbia, Victor Richards, who was then the chairman at Stanford, said that if you come back and join the faculty, we're going to make you our representative for the award next year. And what they did, there wasn't a lot of money involved, but there was a lot of prestige to it. Each medical school in the country could put up a candidate each year to get the scholarship. And it didn't matter what field they were in. And they selected you or not selected you by the house party technique. So I went to the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado, and the jury were all non-doctors. They would be head of a big law firm, they would be a president of a university, etc. And they were told that there were, say, 25 candidates there, and you're going to live with them for a week. And during that time, the jury also, if they were married, their wives were there. And we had lunch with them, dinner with them, etc. And they were told that academically, they're all the same. What we're interested in is you deciding which 5 of the 25 are going to be leaders. And so after this was over, you went back home and you either got a telegram saying you were made a scholar or not. And every year the scholars had a national meeting someplace in the country. And of course the scholars, it turned out to be all different branches of surgery. A number of them were surgeons, but it was a fascinating experience educationally.
You founded a department of surgery. What are the challenges of being the first member and the founder of a department of surgery?
Well, it was so much different at that time because you were in charge of all surgery. Not different. You were in charge of all the departments of surgery, and even I was in charge of anesthesia. And remember, Bill Longmire used to call me and say, you know, don't forget, we run anesthesia too, you know. And at UCLA, anesthesia was part of the department. Dave Savaston was doing the same thing, calling me, and don't let any of those specialists escape. You're the chairman. So that was a big job, and when you think back on it, compared to what a chairman's job is now.
I understand that you knew one of the pioneers of vascular surgery, Norman Freeman. Why don't you tell us about him and what he contributed to our specialty of vascular surgery?
Well, Norman Freeman was from Philadelphia, and he had his training at Yale and at Harvard, and he turned out to be the first American surgeon who was a pure American surgeon. After all this training, he went back to the University of Pennsylvania where he'd started, and practiced pure vascular surgery in 1938. But after the war, he was assigned to head up a vascular unit in California of servicemen coming back from the war. There were, I think, 3 or 4 such hospitals designated throughout the United States. And one day he was giving a special talk in San Francisco, and the chairman of surgery at San Francisco at the time was a neurosurgeon. He was so impressed with his talk that he invited him to be the chief of vascular surgery at UC San Francisco. So he did that, and Jack Wiley was one of his sort of first proteges. And they initially worked together, and sort of like in Houston, they competed against one another, and they became non-friendly. But some of the things that he did the first AAA aneurysm resection ever. We hear that DeVos did the first one, but in actual fact, about 2 months before DeVos did his in Europe, he opened the aneurysm, and he took a vein in the upper abdomen and substituted that for the graft. And that first patient, the graft ruptured. The second one he did, after he had put the vein in, he took some of patient's own blood and put that between the stent, between the graft, and closed the aorta over. And it worked. And so 2 years later, he wrote a follow-up on that.
What other procedures
he did the
do?
first fem-fem in the world, although it's attributed to others. He took the vein out in the leg, kept it attached here, and ran it subcutaneously over to the other groin. And that's written up in California medicine.
He also wasn't he involved with the non-invasive testing in the vascular lab? Didn't he do
He
some
did the
early-
first, he built the first vascular lab in the country in San Francisco. So those are some of the, he did the first endarterectomy of renal stenosis. This was a patient, he was going to do endarterectomy of the abdominal aorta, and while he was scrubbing, a young surgeon, not even in the field of general surgery, said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to do this endarterectomy of the abdominal aorta." And the young man said, "Does the patient have hypertension?" And Freeman said, "Yes, I think he does, you know." And so the young fellow said, "Let's look at do you have an arteriogram?" And he said, "Yes, it's right here." And he looked at it, and there was stenosis of the renal artery. So the young surgeon said, while you've got the abdominal aorta open, why don't you reach in and pull out that plug of atheroma that's causing that stenosis? So he did that, and the patient was cured of hypertension. So that's another interesting first that Dr. Freeman did.
Dr. Connolly, when you started, board certification didn't exist, and I understand that you have one of the first certificates. What was your contribution to the vascular surgery boards?
Well, it was interesting. You know, when I was at Mass General as a medical student, Dr. Churchill, I scrubbed with him. He was the chairman of surgery at that time there. And he was cussing all the time, saying, you know, they're trying to make a American Board of Thoracic Surgery, and that's going to be the ruination of surgery. We must not separate. We must be the same. And it was only after World War II when the surgeons came back, thoracic surgeons came back from the war, that they were able to push through and get a board in thoracic surgery. So in 1982, I was the chair of the Board of Regents, and I was also on the board of vascular surgery. And it was proposed that a vascular board might be possible. And the chief of American College of Surgeons, Rollo Hanlon, was equally against it and talked the same way that Churchill talked when I was a medical student. And so anyway, we got together, and I knew that Dr. was against it, but I didn't realize how strongly he was against it. But at any rate, we were not able, there was Jack Wiley, Fry, and myself, all were there representing the board of surgery, not yet the vascular. And we weren't able to get a separate board. But we made a compromise and got a board of vascular surgery would remain under the parent American Board of Surgery. And now I think, gosh, about 3,000, I think, or more vascular surgeons are now certified. And why was I so in favor of it when my boss was against it? It was because I saw so many badly performed vascular procedures by general surgeons in some of the hospitals that I worked with. And I thought that this would be advantageous, very much so, for the patient.
Do you think that the vascular surgery boards will remain as closely connected as they are now to the American Board of Surgery? Will that relationship continue to exist, or do you think that they'll become as independent as thoracic surgery?
I don't know. I know that the authorities that run the American Board of Surgery are strongly in favor of keeping it the way it is. So what will happen, I don't know, but we certainly have, vascular surgery certainly made a great advance by being, at least in the relationship they are now, with the American Board.
You've been one of the great ambassadors in vascular surgery, particularly in Europe, and you've received honorary degrees from the Royal College of England, Ireland, and Scotland, as well as Japan. How'd you develop an interest in travel and collaboration with colleagues from around the world, and how did you develop this position of being considered ambassador for all of vascular surgery?
Well, I suppose that it started with my spending that year in England. It was a great eye-opener, and as I mentioned, I got to see some of the other countries. And when I got my own department, I thought it would be nice to exchange some of our residents, and we were able to do that. What we did, we would send a single, not a single by marriage, but a single resident, usually about the third year, and we would trade houses and automobiles and jobs. And at that time, you could send somebody over and they were actually able to operate in London. No longer can we do that, so that has been a problem. Another thing that happened, I was interested in selective brain cooling at the time, and the professor, distinguished professor in Tokyo, was working on the same thing. So he invited me to Tokyo as a visiting professor. And we got to know one another, and at that time he said, you know, we don't have any research laboratories or anything. Could I send some of our young men over? So that over the period of time, about 20 Japanese surgeons from Tokyo University, the premier university at that time, and they spent 2 years with us. And then the arrangement was that they were always going to go back, so that they all went back, and now we have a subsidiary of the Connolly Society in Tokyo.
Yeah, you've developed quite a following of surgeons that you trained or have developed a relationship with through your travels. And I guess it culminated in the founding of the John Connolly Surgical Society. What impact has that society had on both you and also the people that you have trained that are now back in their home countries?
Well, of course, naturally I've enjoyed it. We have a meeting every year, usually at the time of the College of Surgeons. And I think it's been mutually advantageous for our former residents to come back to the mother house and learn what we're doing, and I think it's worked out well, as has been the case in most medical schools in the United States.
Your son Peter is now a young vascular surgeon at Cornell. Your brother is a distinguished emeritus professor of neurosurgery from Tulane and Oxnard Clinic, and your father was a distinguished surgeon at Creighton. Is there something of a surgical gene in your family, or was it the environment that your family's created that led to so many in your family becoming surgeons?
I don't know. I hope it's the genes. I just thought we enjoyed medicine. It's changed a lot, though. It's so different, because when my father was professor at Creighton, there was no salaries for the professors. They made their money in private practice, so they had to practice and teach at the same time. That's all changed so much since then. But I think that if you live in a family that had happy doctors practicing, it's a fascinating field, and so I'm happy that some of it happened in our family.
Yeah, you must be very proud of your son.
I am.
Following exactly your career.
Well, he's even in vascular surgery.
Yeah. I know that you've written about awake carotid surgery, in situ bypass, and spinal cord ischemia following aortic surgery, as well as a number of other topics. What would you consider to be the greatest contributions that you've made scientifically to the field of vascular surgery?
Well, one of the research projects that wouldn't be entirely vascular, it's vascular and thoracic, was our studies on hypothermia, profound hypothermia. In 1959, I started that research at Stanford. And I might say the interesting thing about Stanford at that time was all of the faculty, the full-time faculty, which were 5 or 6 surgeons, they all had projects in the dog lab, whether they're professor, chairman, or what. Every one of them had a project and spent at least 1 day a week in the dog lab. And so I started a project at that time, at the same time that Norm Shumway was starting his transposition of the heart. Half of the lab was mine, and half of the lab was his. And we did studies on profound hypothermia, and we monitored the brain temperature. And we also demonstrated that you could actually put a needle into the brain, and not only in dogs but also in patients safely, because at that time the questionable thing was it safe for the brain? And so I think that has been the most interesting and worthwhile of the subjects that I've worked on.
In finishing up, what do you see as some of the greatest challenges to the field of vascular surgery? Going forward, what do you think will be the issues that we'll need to confront as vascular surgeons?
Well, first of all, over my career, I think that that medicine has become a little bit of business rather than science. So I hope that the number of vascular surgeons that are doing basic research, I hope will continue. I don't know what's going to happen with endovascular. None of us know whether it's going to be as successful as it appears to be 5 or 10 years from now. If it isn't successful, then that's going to change things considerably.
Is there anything else that the world should know about the distinguished career of Jack Connolly that I haven't asked you today?
Well, I would say about contacts throughout the world. I think it's been the most interesting part of my career, getting to know my colleagues in most countries of the world. And I think we know one another better than the members of the State Department, because they go in and out of office with administration changes, but we don't. And for instance, I was invited to Iran about 1.5 years ago to give some talks. And the State Department didn't want me to go, but they said if I go, they can't stop me. So my wife and I went, and this was right before the election, or couple of months before the election of the president there. And the whole world was interested in that. And so we got a chance to talk to a lot of the doctors there, and we had the definite idea that he was going to be defeated, et cetera, et cetera. But when we got back home, I was sort of surprised that the State Department didn't call and say, what did you experience? What did the doctors think, and so forth? But I didn't hear a thing, because I don't think they thought that doctors should be involved in judging countries. But since just in the last 6 months, I've had correspondence with the Middle East, with several surgeons there, in Iran, not back in Iran, but in Lebanon. And we've learned that we can communicate back email to these various countries, and we can continue our friendship. So I think if you younger people have any chance to get to be visiting professor someplace, go. And also you'll have the chance to enjoy not only science and vascular surgery, but the whole country.
Dr. Connolly, thank you so much for providing insight to both your personal and professional life.